Billionaire widower forces his maid to pretend to be his daughter's mother. But he gets jealous. She knew the sound of his footsteps before he even reached the marble staircase. Grace Thompson adjusted the fresh orchids in the crystal vase, her fingers moving with practiced precision as the grandfather clock chimed 7:30. Every morning brought the same routine in the Sterling mansion, pristine, predictable, and painfully silent. Christopher Sterling descended the curved staircase like a king surveying his domain. At 42, he commanded respect without saying a word. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his dark hair immaculately styled, and his steel blue eyes held the same coldness that had made him billions in California real estate. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," Grace said softly, not expecting a response. She never got one. He paused at the breakfast table, checking his platinum watch. The Wall Street Journal lay folded beside his black coffee. No sugar, no cream. Nothing that might suggest humanity lived beneath that expensive exterior. "Emma's still sleeping," Grace continued, pouring fresh orange juice into a small glass decorated with cartoon butterflies. She had another nightmare about the accident. For just a moment, Christopher's jaw tightened. 3 years since the car crash that took his wife, and his 8-year-old daughter still woke up screaming. But instead of acknowledging the pain, he simply picked up his briefcase. "I have meetings until 7, he said, his voice as emotionless as a boardroom presentation. "Make sure Emma finishes her piano practice." Grace watched him walk toward the door, her heart aching for the little girl upstairs who desperately needed her father's attention. "Mr. Sterling, about Emma's parent-teacher conference next week. Handle it." The words cut through the air like ice. They specifically requested both parents attend. "It's about her behavior in class," and the front door slammed shut. Grace stood alone in the sprawling kitchen, surrounded by Italian marble and German appliances that cost more than most people's homes. Everything was perfect except the family that lived here. She climbed the staircase to Emma's room, her worn sneakers silent against the plush carpet. The little girl was awake, clutching a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. "Morning, sweetheart," Grace whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. Emma's blonde curls were tangled from restless sleep, her green eyes, so much like her father's, rimmed with exhaustion. "I dreamed about Mommy again," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Grace's heart broke a little more. She'd been caring for this child for 2 years, watching her struggle with grief that her father refused to acknowledge. "Want to tell me about it?" Emma shook her head and buried her face in the elephant. "Daddy left already, didn't he?" "He had important business meetings," Grace said gently, though the excuse tasted bitter on her tongue. "He always does." Emma's voice carried a sadness that no 8-year-old should know. Grace helped Emma get dressed for school, braiding her hair and listening to her practice spelling words during breakfast. The child chattered about her friend's birthday party, her art class project, her favorite book, all the things her father should know but didn't. As they waited for the school car, Emma tugged on Grace's cardigan. "Grace, can I ask you something?" "Anything, honey." "Do you think Daddy would come to my school play if I asked really, really nicely?" Grace knelt down, looking into those hopeful green eyes. How could she explain that Christopher Sterling had built walls so high around his heart that even his own daughter couldn't climb them? "I think your daddy loves you very much," she said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have trouble showing it." The car arrived, and Grace watched Emma climb in with her small backpack. As the vehicle disappeared down the winding driveway, Grace felt that familiar weight of responsibility. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the only mother figure this child had known. Later that afternoon, as she folded Emma's laundry in the pristine bedroom, Grace found the school notice tucked between textbooks. The parent-teacher conference. Required attendance. Both parents. She stared at the bold letters, knowing Christopher would never agree to attend. He'd send her with his credit card and assume money could solve whatever problem Emma was having. But as she looked around the room, at the drawings Emma had made of their family that always included Grace, at the photos on the nightstand where a father and daughter smiled stiffly at the camera, she made a decision that would change everything. She would make him go, even if it meant pretending to be something she wasn't. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Grace heard Christopher's car pull into the circular driveway. She took a deep breath, smoothing her simple dress, and prepared for the conversation that would either save this broken family or destroy the only stability she'd ever known. The conference room door would either open her future or end her career forever. Grace stood outside Christopher's home office, her hand trembling slightly as she held the school notice. Through the frosted glass, she could see his silhouette hunched over architectural blueprints, completely absorbed in his work. The man who could build empires but couldn't build a relationship with his own daughter. She knocked twice. Firm, professional. "Come in." The office was a monument to success. Awards lining mahogany shelves, photographs with senators and celebrities. A view of Beverly Hills that cost more per square foot than most people's entire homes. Christopher didn't look up from his blueprints, his Mont Blanc pen making precise notes in the margins. "Emma's asleep," Grace said, placing the conference notice on his desk. "But we need to discuss this." He glanced at the paper, his expression unchanging. "I told you to handle it. Mr. Sterling, they won't accept me as a substitute. The principal specifically stated both parents must attend. Emma's teacher is concerned about her withdrawal from social activities, her difficulty concentrating and—" Grace hesitated, then pushed forward. "Her separation anxiety." Christopher finally looked up, those steel blue eyes cold as winter morning. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Thompson?" Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs. What she was about to propose was either brilliantly bold or career suicide. "I'm suggesting you attend the conference as Emma's father, and she took a breath. "I attend as her mother." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Christopher set down his pen with deliberate precision, leaning back in his leather chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the same tone he used to crush business competitors. "You want to pose as my wife. I want to give Emma what she needs," Grace corrected firmly. "A united front. Two parents who actually know what's happening in her life. Two people who can answer questions about her favorite subjects, her fears, her dreams. And you think you know those things better than I do." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Grace met his gaze without flinching. "I know she still sleeps with the elephant your wife gave her. I know she's terrified of thunderstorms, but loves the sound of rain on windows. I know she draws pictures of families with 3 people, and in every single one, the woman has brown hair and is wearing an apron." Something flickered across Christopher's face, too quick to identify. Pain? Regret? He stood abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the perfectly manicured garden. "The social circles at Westfield Academy are particular," he said slowly. "These people notice everything. Designer clothes, proper etiquette, the right connections. You'd need to look the part." Grace's pulse quickened. Was he actually considering this? "I understand. Do you?" He turned, his eyes scanning her simple cardigan and practical flats. "These women spend more on handbags than you make in 6 months. They vacation in the Hamptons and discuss their children's Ivy League prospects over $1,500 bottles of wine." "Then teach me," Grace said quietly. "You have 3 days." Christopher studied her for a long moment, his business mind clearly calculating risks and benefits. "Why would you do this? What do you get out of pretending to be something you're not?" The answer came from somewhere deep in Grace's chest, from 2 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and midnight tears. "I get to see Emma smile during that conference instead of apologizing for her father's absence." Again, the words hit their target. Christopher's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of corporate indifference slipped completely. Grace saw something raw underneath, a father who knew he was failing but didn't know how to fix it. "There would be rules," he said finally. "This is a business arrangement. You play the role, answer the questions, and afterwards we return to our normal routine. No complications, no emotional entanglements." Grace nodded, though something in her chest twisted at his clinical tone. "Of course. I'll have my personal shopper select appropriate attire. We'll rehearse your background story. 1 evening only, Ms. Thompson. That's all this is." "I understand, Mr. Sterling." He moved back to his desk, already reaching for his phone to make arrangements. But as Grace turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Grace." She looked back, surprised by his use of her first name. "Emma's teacher will ask about her mother, about the accident. Can you handle that conversation?" For a moment, Grace saw past the billionaire facade to the broken widower underneath, a man still drowning in grief, still running from the ghosts that haunted this mansion. "I can handle whatever Emma needs me to handle," she said softly. Christopher nodded once, then returned to his blueprints. But as Grace closed the office door behind her, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. What had she just agreed to do? And more importantly, what would happen when the performance was over and she had to go back to being invisible? The woman in the mirror looked like someone Grace had never met before. Isabella Rossetti, Christopher's personal shopper, circled her like a sculptor examining marble. The boutique in Rodeo Drive was smaller than Grace's apartment, but every item hanging on the racks cost more than she'd earned in the past 6 months. Bone structure is excellent, Isabella murmured, her Italian accent thick with approval. And these eyes, very expressive. Christopher was right to call me. Grace stood still as Isabella held different fabrics against her skin, feeling like a mannequin being dressed for display. Through the boutique window, she watched wealthy women glide past in designer heels, their movements fluid with confidence she'd never possessed. Tell me, Isabella said, selecting a navy blue dress that looked deceptively simple. What exactly is your relationship with Mr. Sterling? The question caught Grace off guard. I work for him. Isabella's dark eyes sparkled with knowing amusement. And now you will play his wife for an evening. Interesting arrangement. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's for Emma, his daughter. Of course it is, cara mia. Isabella smiled mysteriously and held up the dress. Try this. And Grace, when you walk into that school tomorrow night, remember, you are not pretending to be worthy of Christopher Sterling. You are allowing him the privilege of standing beside you. An hour later, Grace stood in the Sterling Mansion's guest bathroom, staring at her reflection in disbelief. The navy dress hugged her curves in ways her usual cardigans never did. The fabric was silk, softer than anything she'd ever owned, and it moved like water when she walked. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Grace, are you ready for our rehearsal? Christopher's voice through the door sent nervous butterflies through her stomach. She opened it to find him waiting in the hallway, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The dress fits well. Isabella has good taste, Grace managed, trying to ignore the way his gaze lingered on her face. We should practice, he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. The conference is tomorrow. They moved to the living room where Christopher had prepared index cards with biographical details. Grace sat on the cream-colored sofa, while he paced like a general preparing for battle. We met 5 years ago at a charity auction, he began, reading from his notes. You were working in event planning. We married after an 8-month courtship. You gave up your career to focus on Emma and philanthropy. Grace nodded, memorizing the fiction. What about Emma's mother? What do I say about the accident? Christopher stopped pacing. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Diana died 3 years ago, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Car accident during a thunderstorm. Emma was in the vehicle but survived with minor injuries. We don't discuss details beyond that. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. That must have been... We're not discussing my personal life, Ms. Thompson. We're creating a believable cover story. But Grace saw through his professional mask to the pain underneath. What was she like? Diana? Christopher's hands stilled on the index cards. Why would that matter for tomorrow? Because if I'm going to pretend to be Emma's mother, I need to understand the woman I'm replacing, even if it's just for one evening. For a long moment, Christopher was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She laughed at everything. Bad movies, my terrible jokes, Emma's attempts at singing. The house was never quiet when Diana was alive. She made everything brighter. Grace felt her heart crack open at the raw grief in his voice. She sounds wonderful. She was. Christopher cleared his throat, returning to his cards. But that's not relevant to tomorrow's performance. They practiced for another hour. Safe topics of conversation, Emma's academic progress, appropriate responses to social pleasantries. But Grace found herself studying Christopher instead of the script. The way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he was thinking. The way his voice softened when he mentioned Emma's accomplishments. The way he seemed to forget she was his employee when they talked about his daughter. I think that's sufficient preparation, he said finally, gathering his notes. Tomorrow evening, we'll arrive at 6:30 sharp. The conference is scheduled for 7. Grace nodded, standing to leave. But as she reached the living room entrance, Christopher's voice stopped her. Grace. She turned back, surprised by the uncertainty in his tone. Are you having second thoughts about this arrangement? She looked at this powerful man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, now asking for her reassurance like a nervous teenager before prom. No, she said quietly. But are you? Their eyes met across the expanse of imported marble and designer furniture. For just a moment, Grace saw something that made her pulse quicken. Not the cold businessman, but the man underneath, vulnerable, hopeful, almost human. Tomorrow night changes nothing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Grace nodded and headed upstairs, but her reflection in the hallway mirrors told a different story. Tomorrow night was going to change everything. When Grace walked down the marble staircase that evening, Christopher forgot how to breathe. The woman descending toward him bore no resemblance to the quiet housekeeper who served his morning coffee. Isabella's team had worked magic. Grace's honey blonde hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. Her makeup was subtle but stunning, and the navy dress transformed her from invisible employee to breathtaking woman. But it was something else that stopped him cold. The confidence. The way she carried herself like she belonged in his world instead of serving it. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Christopher nodded, not trusting his voice. He offered his arm, a gesture that felt surprisingly natural, and led her toward the waiting Mercedes. As they settled into the leather seats, he caught a hint of her perfume, something floral and warm that made him want to lean closer. "Remember," he said, starting the engine, "we're presenting a united front. These people are experts at detecting weakness." "I understand." Grace smoothed her dress, trying to calm her racing heart. "What if they ask about our relationship? How we fell in love?" The question hung between them as Christopher navigated through Beverly Hills traffic. How did one invent a love story with someone sitting inches away? Someone whose real smile he'd never actually seen. "We'll keep it simple," he said finally. "Love at first sight. Very romantic, very believable." But as they pulled into Westfield Academy's circular driveway, Grace felt anything but simple. The private school looked like a small university, all ivy-covered brick and towering windows. Parents in designer clothing moved toward the entrance, their conversations peppered with mentions of vacation homes and college prep courses. "Grace," Christopher's hand covered hers briefly. "You can do this." The touch sent electricity up her arm, but she nodded and stepped out of the car. They walked through the academy's polished hallways like they'd done it 100 times before. Christopher's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that felt surprisingly real. Grace smiled and nodded at other parents, channeling every confident woman she'd ever watched from the shadows. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," a voice called from behind them. They turned to see Bradley Whitmore approaching, a divorced attorney Grace recognized from society pages. He was handsome in that practiced California way. Perfect teeth, expensive haircut, tan that suggested frequent golf games. "Bradley," Christopher said coolly, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on Grace's back. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," Bradley said, his eyes fixed entirely on Grace. "Bradley Whitmore, and you must be the famous Mrs. Sterling I've heard so much about." Grace extended her hand with practiced elegance. "Grace Sterling, lovely to meet you." "The pleasure is entirely mine." Bradley held her hand longer than necessary. "I was just telling the Hendersons how much I'd love to discuss your foundation work. I hear you're doing remarkable things with underprivileged children." "Foundation work?" Grace felt panic flutter in her chest, but she kept her smile steady. "It's incredibly rewarding. Perhaps we could arrange lunch sometime. I have some ideas about expanding youth programs that might interest you." Christopher stepped closer to Grace, his body language screaming ownership. "My wife's schedule is quite full." "Of course," Bradley smiled, but his eyes remained on Grace. "Perhaps a coffee then? I'd love to hear about your hands-on approach with the children." Grace felt the tension radiating from Christopher like heat from a furnace. Something dangerous flickered in his steel blue eyes, something that looked remarkably like jealousy. "I'd be happy to discuss it," Grace said smoothly, "but perhaps through our office. My assistant can arrange something appropriate." Bradley handed her a business card, his fingers brushing hers deliberately. "I look forward to it." As he walked away, Christopher remained silent, but Grace could feel his mood shift like storm clouds gathering. "Nicely handled," he said finally, his voice tight. "Thank you. Though next time, perhaps less encouragement." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "Encouragement? I was being polite. You asked me to play a role, Christopher. You didn't ask me to be invisible." Something in her tone, the use of his first name, the steel in her voice, made him look at her differently. Not as his employee, but as the woman she was pretending to be. His equal. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." The apology surprised them both. They found Emma's classroom, where Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman in her 50s, greeted them warmly. As they settled into tiny plastic chairs designed for children, Grace felt Christopher's knee brush against hers. "Thank you both for coming," Mrs. Patterson began. "Emma is a bright child, but I'm concerned about her social withdrawal. She seems to be carrying some heavy emotional burdens for someone so young." Grace leaned forward. What specific behaviors are you seeing? She's reluctant to participate in group activities. During free reading time, she often chooses books about families and loss. And yesterday, during our family tree project, Mrs. Patterson hesitated. What happened? Christopher asked. She drew 3 people, but when I asked about them, she said she wasn't sure if she was allowed to include the person who takes care of her because that person isn't really family. Grace felt her heart break. Christopher's hand found hers under the tiny table, squeezing gently. We'll address that at home, Grace said softly. Emma needs to understand that family comes in many forms. As the conference continued, Grace found herself answering most questions, while Christopher listened intently. She knew Emma's favorite subjects, her fear of thunderstorms, her love of piano, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She spoke about Emma with the detailed knowledge and fierce love of a mother. When they finally left the classroom, Christopher was quiet during the walk to the parking lot. You were remarkable in there, he said as they reached the car. I just talked about Emma. No. He stopped beside the Mercedes, studying her face in the moonlight. You were her mother. Completely, naturally, beautifully her mother. Grace felt something shift between them, something that had nothing to do with their pretend marriage and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Christopher, I watched you in there and I realized something. His voice was barely above a whisper. I've been so busy protecting myself from feeling anything that I almost missed what was right in front of me. Grace's breath caught in her throat, but before either of them could say another word, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell, and what Christopher would discover next would shatter everything they thought they knew about this arrangement. The sound of approaching footsteps belonged to Emma herself, running toward them in pajamas and rain boots. Daddy! Grace! The 8-year-old launched herself between them, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly neighbor who had been watching Emma, hurried to catch up. I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Caldwell panted. She woke up from another nightmare and insisted you were in danger. She wouldn't calm down until I brought her here. Christopher knelt beside his daughter, his expensive suit forgotten. Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong? I dreamed about the accident again, Emma sobbed, clinging to both Christopher and Grace. But this time you were both in the car, and I lost everyone. Grace's heart shattered as she felt the little girl's arms wrap around her waist. Through her tears, Emma looked up at them with wonder. You look so pretty, Grace. Like a real mommy. The innocent words hit like lightning. Christopher's eyes met Grace's over Emma's head, and something profound passed between them. Not the careful arrangement they'd negotiated, but something raw and real and terrifying. Let's get you home, baby, Grace whispered, lifting Emma into her arms. The child fit perfectly against her hip like she'd been holding her forever. During the drive back to the mansion, Emma fell asleep curled between them, her small hand holding both of theirs. Grace watched Christopher's profile in the dim light of passing street lamps, seeing a father finally beginning to understand what he'd been missing. Once Mrs. Caldwell had gone home and Emma was tucked safely back in bed, Grace and Christopher found themselves alone in the kitchen. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. I should change, Grace said finally, gesturing to her elegant dress. Don't. The word escaped Christopher before he could stop it. Not yet. Grace turned back to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. He was leaning against the marble counter, his perfect composure finally cracking. What happened tonight? He began, then stopped. Was just pretend, Grace finished, though her voice lacked conviction. Was it? Christopher stepped closer, his steel blue eyes searching her face. Because when Emma ran to us, when she called you mommy, it didn't feel like acting. Grace's breath caught. They were standing in dangerous territory now, far from the safe boundaries of employer and employee. Christopher, we agreed. Forget what we agreed. His voice was rough with emotion. Tell me what you felt when she wrapped her arms around both of us. Tell me what you felt when that man was flirting with you and I wanted to... He stopped abruptly. Wanted to what? Grace whispered. Wanted to claim you. Right there in front of everyone. Wanted to make it clear that you belonged to me. The confession hung in the air between them like a live wire. Grace felt her pulse racing, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. I felt like I was home, she admitted quietly. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. With you. With Emma. Like we were a real family. Christopher moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. Grace, but I'm not her mother, Grace said, stepping back before she lost herself completely. I'm not your wife. I'm the woman who cleans your house and makes your daughter's breakfast. And tomorrow morning, that's exactly what I'll be again. Something flickered across Christopher's face. Pain, maybe, or regret. What if I don't want that? What are you saying? I'm saying that watching you tonight, seeing you with Emma, seeing how perfectly you fit into our lives. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its perfect style. I'm saying that maybe this arrangement doesn't have to end. Grace felt the floor shift beneath her feet. You want me to keep pretending to be your wife? I want you to consider becoming my wife. For real. The words exploded between them like a bomb. Grace stared at him, unable to process what she'd just heard. That's impossible, she breathed. Why? Because you don't love me. The words tore from her throat. You love the idea of convenience. You love having someone to take care of Emma so you don't have to feel guilty anymore. But you don't love me. Christopher's face went pale. How can you say that? Because love isn't a business transaction, Christopher. It's not something you negotiate with contracts and conditions. It's messy and complicated and terrifying. He finished quietly. Believe me, I know. Grace saw the truth in his eyes then. This powerful man who commanded empires was absolutely terrified of the feelings she'd awakened in him. I can't be your convenient solution, she said, her voice breaking. I won't be the replacement wife you hire to make your life easier. That's not what I'm asking, isn't it? Grace moved toward the kitchen door, needing space to breathe. You've spent 3 years avoiding your grief, avoiding your daughter, avoiding life, and now you want to avoid dealing with real emotions by turning our fake marriage into a real one. Christopher followed her, his composure completely shattered. Grace, please. I need to think, she said, not trusting herself to look at him. This is too much, too fast, too. The sound of Emma's bedroom door opening upstairs stopped them both. They heard small feet padding across the hallway. Then Emma's voice calling softly. Grace? Are you still here? Grace closed her eyes, feeling torn in two. Upstairs was a little girl who needed her. Standing beside her was a man who claimed to want her. And somewhere in between was her own heart, breaking with the impossibility of it all. I'm here, sweetheart, Grace called back, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. As she headed toward the stairs, Christopher caught her hand. This conversation isn't over, he said quietly. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back at his face. Maybe it should be. She pulled free and walked upstairs, leaving Christopher alone in his perfect kitchen, finally understanding that some things couldn't be bought or negotiated. They could only be earned. 3 weeks later, the Sterling mansion felt like a museum where two people carefully avoided each other's exhibits. Grace folded Emma's school uniforms with mechanical precision, her movements efficient, but hollow. The navy dress from that night hung in her closet like a ghost, beautiful, untouchable, and haunting her with memories she couldn't escape. Since their conversation in the kitchen, Christopher had retreated behind walls higher than before. He left earlier, returned later, and communicated through terse notes left on the marble counter. Emma has piano at 4. Dinner with clients tonight. Handle the grocery order. As if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't offered her his name and she hadn't shattered both their hearts by refusing it. Grace, why doesn't Daddy eat breakfast with us anymore? Emma asked, her small voice cutting through the morning silence. Grace looked down at the 8-year-old, who was picking at her pancakes with unusual listlessness. Emma had grown quieter since the school conference, more clingy, as if she sensed the tension crackling between the adults in her life. Your daddy has very important business meetings, Grace said gently, the familiar excuse tasting bitter on her tongue. But he used to at least say goodbye. Emma's green eyes, so much like her father's, filled with confusion. Did I do something wrong? Is he mad because I ran to the school that night? Grace's heart cracked wider. She knelt beside Emma's chair, taking the child's small hands in hers. Oh, sweetheart, none of this is your fault. Your daddy loves you very much. Then why does he look so sad when he thinks nobody's watching? The question hung in the air like smoke. Because Grace had noticed it too. The way Christopher's shoulders sagged when he thought he was alone. The way his coffee sat untouched on his desk. The way he stood at Emma's bedroom door in the evenings but never went inside. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about their feelings, Grace said carefully. It doesn't mean they love you any less. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Grace found herself in Christopher's office, delivering the quarterly household reports he'd requested. He looked up from his laptop and, for a moment, their eyes met across the mahogany desk. He looked exhausted. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie slightly crooked, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "The Henderson account came through," he said, his voice professionally neutral. "I'll be traveling to Seattle next week for the closing." "How long?" Grace asked, hating how her pulse quickened at the thought of him leaving. 4 days. "Can you manage Emma's schedule?" As if she hadn't been managing Emma's entire life for 2 years. Grace nodded stiffly. "Of course." Christopher returned to his laptop, effectively dismissing her. But as Grace reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Grace." She turned back, hope flickering dangerously in her chest. "Mrs. Patterson called. Emma's been having difficulty concentrating in class. She thinks—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "She thinks Emma is picking up on tension at home." The implication hung between them like an accusation. Their careful avoidance was hurting the child they both claimed to protect. "What do you suggest?" Grace asked quietly. "I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him. "I've never been good at this. Diana always handled the emotional complications." For the first time since their kitchen confrontation, Grace saw past his defensive walls to the lost man underneath. "Emma needs stability, Christopher. She needs to know that the people she loves aren't going anywhere." "Like you're going somewhere?" The question was barely above a whisper, but it hit like a sledgehammer. Grace felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "I'm still here," she said. "But for how long?" Christopher stood, moving closer. "How long before you decide this situation is too uncomfortable? Before you find another family to care for? Is that what you think? That I'd abandon Emma?" "I think you're terrified," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think what happened between us that night scared you so badly that you're looking for reasons to run." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You don't understand. Then explain it to me." Christopher was standing close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne. "Explain why you won't even consider that what we have could be real." "Because I've seen what happens when people like me try to fit into worlds like this," Grace said, her voice breaking. "My mother was a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Connecticut. She fell in love with the man she worked for, and when his friends found out, they destroyed her. Made her feel so small, so worthless that she never recovered." Christopher's face went pale. "Grace, I would never—" "You wouldn't mean to," she interrupted. "But eventually, you'd resent me. You'd wonder what your business associates think about your housekeeper wife. You'd start seeing me the way they do, as the help who got above her station. That's not who I am, isn't it?" Grace stepped back, needing distance. 3 weeks ago, you could barely remember my name. Now you want to marry me because I played dress-up convincingly for one evening." The words hit their target. Christopher flinched as if she'd slapped him. "That's not why," he said quietly. "Then why?" The question tore from her throat. "Why now, Christopher? What changed?" He was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I watched you with Emma that night, and I realized you weren't acting. You love her, really love her. And for the first time since Diana died, I could imagine our house feeling like a home again." Grace felt her heart breaking all over again. "So I was right. You want me because I'm convenient, because I can give you back the family feeling you lost." "No." Christopher's voice was fierce now. "I want you because when you smiled at me in that classroom, I remembered what it felt like to be alive. I want you because you make Emma laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I want you because—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "Because what?" "Because I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Grace stared at him, seeing the truth written in every line of his face. This wasn't about convenience or replacement mothers or business arrangements. This was about a man who had locked his heart away for 3 years, finally finding someone worth the risk of opening it again. "Christopher," she whispered. The sound of Emma's school bus pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Grace heard the front door slam, followed by Emma's voice calling for her. "We can't do this," Grace said, stepping away from him. "Emma needs stability, not 2 adults who can't figure out what they want from each other." She left Christopher standing alone in his office, but as she walked toward Emma's cheerful voice, she carried his confession with her like a secret burning in her chest. And for the first time since that night in the kitchen, Grace began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. Grace found Christopher in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, sitting in darkness with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. She'd come downstairs for water after another sleepless night, but the sight of him stopped her cold. He looked broken, shoulders hunched, head in his hands, the picture of a man who had lost everything and was finally allowing himself to feel it. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. Christopher looked up, startled. In the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face was a map of exhaustion and pain. "I keep thinking about what you said, about your mother." Grace moved closer, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She wore simple pajamas and a cardigan, looking nothing like the elegant woman who had captivated him at the school conference. But somehow Christopher thought she was even more beautiful this way. Real, unguarded, human. "I shouldn't have thrown that at you," Grace said, settling into the chair across from him. "My past isn't your fault, but it explains everything." Christopher's voice was rough from whiskey and regret. "Why you won't trust this? Why you think I'll eventually see you as less than you are?" They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them like fog. "Her name was Marie," Grace said finally. "My mother. She worked for the Ashford family in Greenwich for 15 years. She loved that job, loved their children like they were her own, and she fell in love with William Ashford after his wife left him." Christopher listened without interrupting, sensing this was a story Grace had never told anyone. For 6 months they were happy. He promised to marry her, said social conventions didn't matter. But when his business partners found out, when his ex-wife threatened to use it against him in custody proceedings, Grace's voice caught. He chose his reputation over her, fired her, had security escort her out like she was a criminal. Grace. She never recovered from the humiliation, spent the rest of her life cleaning houses, never trusting anyone again. She died believing she wasn't worthy of love because of where she came from. Christopher reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I'm not William Ashford. I know." Grace looked down at their joined hands. "But I'm still Marie's daughter. I still clean houses and live paycheck to paycheck. I still don't belong in boardrooms and charity galas. Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Christopher's voice was intense in the darkness. "I see a woman who speaks 3 languages because she wanted to read to Emma in Spanish and French. I see someone who remembers every detail of my daughter's life while I was hiding in my office. I see the strongest person I've ever met." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Christopher, I see someone who took a broken little girl and an emotionally dead man and somehow made us feel like family again. That's not—" "It is." Christopher stood, pulling her up with him. "And I see someone who's so afraid of being hurt that she'd rather break both our hearts than take a chance on happiness." They were standing close now, close enough that Grace could see every emotion flickering across his face. Fear, hope, love, desperation, all the things he'd been hiding behind his corporate mask. "What if you're wrong?" she whispered. "What if this is just gratitude, or loneliness, or, then we'll figure it out together." His hands cupped her face gently. "Grace, I know the difference between convenience and love. I was married for 10 years. What I feel for you, it's not about replacing Diana or finding a mother for Emma. It's about you. Just you." Grace felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. "I'm scared." "So am I." Christopher's thumb brushed away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "I'm terrified that you'll leave. I'm terrified that I'll mess this up the way I've messed up everything else since Diana died. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what if." The space between them seemed to shrink until Grace could feel his breath against her lips. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it in the silence. "Christopher," she breathed. But before either of them could close that final distance, the sound of small feet on the stairs broke the spell. They sprang apart just as Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching her stuffed elephant. "I had another bad dream," Emma said, her voice thick with sleep and tears. Grace immediately went to her, kneeling down to wrap the child in her arms. "What happened in the dream, sweetheart?" "Everyone kept leaving," Emma sobbed against Grace's shoulder. "First Mommy, then you, then Daddy, and I was all alone in this big house with nobody to love me." Christopher felt his heart break completely. He knelt beside them, pulling both Grace and Emma into his embrace. "Nobody's leaving, baby girl, I promise." "But Grace might," Emma said, looking between them with eyes too wise for her 8 years. "I heard you fighting. And when grown-ups fight, someone always leaves." Grace and Christopher exchanged a look over Emma's head, a look full of guilt and realization. Their emotional turmoil wasn't just affecting them. It was destroying the one person they both claimed to protect. "Emma," Grace said gently, "sometimes grown-ups have to talk about difficult things, but that doesn't mean anyone is leaving. I'm not going anywhere. Promise?" Emma's green eyes searched Grace's face desperately. Grace felt Christopher's gaze burning into her, felt the weight of a promise that would change everything. I promise. They sat together on the kitchen floor, a billionaire in pajama pants, a housekeeper in her cardigan, and a little girl who had lost too much already, and something shifted in the silence between them. Christopher looked at Grace holding his daughter, saw the love in her eyes that had nothing to do with convenience or employment, and finally understood what he'd been too afraid to see. This wasn't about business arrangements or social expectations or even his own loneliness. This was about family. Real, messy, complicated, beautiful family. And some things were worth fighting for, even if the battle scared you to death. Emma, he said softly, how would you feel if Grace stayed with us forever? Not just as someone who takes care of you, but as part of our family. Emma pulled back to look at both of them, hope blooming across her tear-stained face. Like really forever? Like mommies and daddies forever? Grace felt her breath catch as Christopher reached for her hand. If she'll have us, he said, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. If she's brave enough to take a chance on a man who's still learning how to love again. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Grace looked at this man who had given her his heart, at this child who had given her purpose, at this life that could be hers if she was brave enough to reach for it. And for the first time since her mother's broken dreams had taught her to be afraid, Grace Thompson decided that some promises were worth the risk of breaking. Grace's answer came in the form of a resignation letter left on Christopher's desk the next morning. Christopher found it when he returned from his morning run, the crisp white envelope sitting like a bomb among his business correspondence. His hands trembled as he opened it, reading words that felt like bullets to his chest. Dear Mr. Sterling, please accept this as my formal 2 weeks' notice. My last day of employment will be Friday, November 15th. I have arranged for Mrs. Patterson to recommend a replacement who can provide Emma with the stability she deserves. Thank you for the opportunity to serve your family. Sincerely, Grace Thompson. The formal tone, the return to Mr. Sterling, the complete absence of any reference to the previous night. It was as if their kitchen conversation had been erased, reduced to nothing more than an employer-employee transaction. Christopher was still staring at the letter when Emma burst into his office, school backpack forgotten on the hallway floor. Daddy, where's Grace? She wasn't in the kitchen and her bedroom door is locked and I can't find her anywhere. The panic in his daughter's voice cut through Christopher's shock. He looked down at Emma's tear-filled eyes and realized that Grace's departure wouldn't just break his heart. It would destroy the child who had already lost too much. She's running errands, he lied, pulling Emma onto his lap. She'll be back soon. But even as he said the words, Christopher wondered if they were true. Grace's car was gone, her bedroom emptied of personal belongings. She had vanished as thoroughly as if she'd never existed, leaving only the faint scent of her floral perfume lingering in the hallways. For 3 days, Christopher tried to maintain normal routines while Emma grew increasingly agitated. She refused to eat meals prepared by the temporary housekeeper, spent hours sitting by the front window watching for Grace's return, and had nightmare after nightmare about being abandoned. She's not coming back, is she? Emma asked on Thursday evening, her small voice breaking Christopher's heart all over again. They were sitting in Emma's bedroom, where Christopher had been trying unsuccessfully to read her a bedtime story. But Emma wasn't listening. She was staring at a drawing she'd made of their family that still hung on her wall. I don't know, sweetheart, Christopher admitted, unable to lie to her anymore. It's because of what I said, isn't it? About wanting her to stay forever? Emma's eyes filled with tears. I scared her away by being greedy. Christopher pulled his daughter close, feeling his own eyes burn with unshed tears. No, baby. This isn't your fault. Sometimes grown-ups get scared of their own feelings. Like you did with Mommy at first? The question caught Christopher off guard. What do you mean? Grace told me once that you were really shy when you first met Mommy, that you were so nervous about talking to her that you spilled coffee on yourself. Christopher smiled despite his pain, remembering. Diana had told that story to everyone, how the confident businessman had turned into a fumbling teenager the moment she walked into his life. Grace said that sometimes the best things in life are scary because they matter so much. Emma continued. Maybe Grace is just scared because we matter to her. Out of the mouths of babes. Christopher looked at his 8-year-old daughter and realized she understood something that had taken him 42 years to learn. Love was terrifying precisely because it mattered. Emma, he said slowly, what if we went to find Grace? What if we told her that we're scared too but we want to be brave together? Emma's face lit up with hope. Really? We could do that? If you want to fight for our family, then yes. We fight. The next morning, Christopher called in every favor he had to track down Grace's whereabouts. His private investigator found her in less than 6 hours. She was staying at a small motel near LAX, apparently planning to fly back to her hometown in Ohio. Christopher and Emma drove through Los Angeles traffic in tense silence, both of them rehearsing what they would say. When they finally pulled into the motel parking lot, Christopher felt his courage wavering. What if she refused to see them? What if her decision was final? Daddy, Emma said, taking his hand. Grace always says that brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you're scared. Christopher squeezed his daughter's hand, drawing strength from her wisdom. Together, they walked to room 237 and knocked. The door opened, revealing Grace in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, but she was still the most beautiful woman Christopher had ever seen. Christopher, Emma, her voice was barely a whisper. What are you doing here? We came to bring you home, Emma said, stepping forward with all the fearless confidence of childhood. Please, Grace, I know you're scared, but we're scared too. Can't we be scared together? Grace knelt down to Emma's level, tears streaming down her face. Oh, sweetheart. I drew you another picture, Emma said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. Look. Grace unfolded the drawing to reveal 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. But this time, there were words written in Emma's careful handwriting. My family is brave. You see? Emma said earnestly. We're all brave when we're together, even when we're scared. Grace looked up at Christopher over Emma's head, seeing love and hope and desperation written across his face. Grace, he said quietly, I know I can't promise you that this will be easy. I know there will be people who judge us, who think you don't belong in my world. But I also know that without you, my world isn't worth belonging to. He stepped closer, his voice growing stronger with conviction. I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you are. I'm not asking you to fit into some predetermined role. I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal, my best friend. I'm asking you to help me raise this incredible little girl who loves you more than life itself. Grace stood slowly, still holding Emma's drawing. And what happens when the novelty wears off? When reality sets in? Then we face it together, Christopher said simply, the way families do. Grace looked at this man who had learned to be vulnerable, at this child who had taught them both about courage, and felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there. It always would be. But it was overshadowed by something bigger. Love. Real. Complicated. Terrifying. Beautiful love. I can't promise I'll always be brave, she said softly. None of us can, Christopher replied. But we can promise to try. Emma grabbed both their hands, looking up at them with shining eyes. So does that mean we're a real family now? For real and forever? Grace looked down at this child who had given her purpose, then at the man who had given her hope. Outside the motel room, Los Angeles traffic hummed with the promise of new beginnings. Yes, she said, her voice steady with certainty. Real and forever. And for the first time in 3 years, the Sterling family was finally complete. 2 months later, the phone call that would test everything came at 7 in the morning. Grace was in the kitchen preparing Emma's breakfast when Christopher's phone rang. She watched his face change from sleepy contentment to stone-cold fury as he listened to whoever was on the other end. I understand, he said finally, his voice deadly calm. Thank you for the warning. What's wrong? Grace asked, setting down the orange juice pitcher. Christopher looked at her with something that might have been regret. That was my attorney. Apparently, Bradley Whitmore has been conducting his own investigation into our relationship. He's planning to present his findings to the Westfield Academy Board. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of findings? The kind that reveal our marriage isn't exactly conventional. Christopher's jaw tightened. He has photos from the motel where I found you, documentation of your previous employment, and enough circumstantial evidence to paint a very unflattering picture. The words hit Grace like physical blows. This was exactly what she'd feared, the moment when her past would be weaponized against the people she loved. Why would he do this? She whispered. Because men like Bradley don't like being rejected, Christopher said grimly. And because he knows that scandal could affect my business relationships, Emma's standing at school, our entire life. Emma chose that moment to bounce into the kitchen. already dressed in her uniform and chattering about her upcoming science project. Grace and Christopher immediately shifted into parental mode, discussing homework and piano lessons, as if their world wasn't potentially crumbling around them. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, Christopher paced his office like a caged animal. Grace sat in the leather chair across from his desk, watching him strategize their defense. "My legal team can handle most of this," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Non-disclosure agreements, counter-investigations, standard damage control. But Grace," he stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "This is going to get ugly. Very ugly." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Bradley isn't just going after our relationship. He's going after you personally. Your background, your family's financial struggles, the circumstances of how we met. He wants to paint you as a gold digger who manipulated her way into my life." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. Maybe he's right. "Don't." Christopher's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare give him that power." "But what if he is right, Christopher? What if I did see an opportunity and take it? What if deep down, part of me was attracted to your money, your status, your—" "Stop." Christopher knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Grace, look at me. Do you remember what you said the night I found you at that motel? You said you couldn't promise you'd always be brave." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well, this is one of those times when we have to choose courage over fear. Bradley is counting on us to crumble under pressure, to let shame and doubt destroy what we've built. We can't let him win." But even as Christopher spoke with conviction, Grace could see the worry in his eyes. He was afraid too, afraid of losing his business reputation, afraid of Emma being ostracized at school, afraid that the scandal would touch every aspect of their carefully rebuilt life. That evening, Emma was quieter than usual during dinner. She picked at her food and kept glancing between Grace and Christopher, with the intuitive awareness that children have when adults are hiding something serious. "Are you and Daddy fighting again?" she asked suddenly. Grace and Christopher exchanged glances. They'd agreed not to tell Emma about Bradley's threats until they knew how serious the situation would become. "We're just dealing with some grown-up problems, sweetheart," Grace said gently. "The kind of problems that make people leave?" Emma's voice was small and scared. Christopher reached across the table to take his daughter's hand. "No one is leaving, Emma. I promise you that." But later that night, after Emma was asleep, Grace stood at the bedroom window looking out at the city lights of Beverly Hills. Christopher found her there, wrapped in one of his sweaters, her face reflecting the internal storm she was fighting. "You're thinking about running again," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. He knew her well enough now to read the signs. The way she stood with her arms wrapped around herself, the distance in her eyes, the careful way she was already pulling back emotionally. "I'm thinking about what's best for Emma," Grace replied. "And what's best for you. What's best for us is staying together and fighting this." Grace turned to face him, and Christopher saw something that terrified him. Resignation. "Christopher, be honest with me. When you go into that boardroom next week, when you face your business partners and see the doubt in their eyes, when you have to explain why you married your housekeeper, won't there be part of you that wonders if this was all a mistake?" The question hung between them like a knife. Christopher wanted to deny it immediately, to reassure her with absolute certainty. But Grace deserved honesty, even when the truth was complicated. "There might be," he admitted quietly, "for about 30 seconds. And then I'll remember watching you with Emma, seeing you turn our house into a home, feeling more alive in the past 6 months than I have in 3 years. And I'll know that anyone who can't see your worth isn't someone whose opinion matters to me." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. But what if it's not enough? What if loving each other isn't enough to survive what's coming? Christopher moved closer, pulling her into his arms. "Then we find out together. But Grace, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't make decisions based on fear. Promise me that if you're going to leave, it will be because you genuinely don't want this life, not because you're trying to protect me from embarrassment." Grace buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "I can't promise that, because right now, I don't know the difference between protecting you and protecting myself." Christopher held her tighter, feeling like he was trying to hold water in his hands. "Then promise me you'll stay until we know how this ends. Promise me you'll let us fight for what we have." Grace pulled back to look at him, seeing love and desperation and stubborn determination in his steel blue eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "I promise." But as they held each other in the darkness, Both of them knew that some storms were too powerful to survive, and tomorrow would bring the biggest test their love had ever faced. The Westfield Academy boardroom had never felt more like a courtroom than it did that Tuesday evening. Grace sat beside Christopher at the polished mahogany table, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Around them, the school's board members, influential parents and educators who held Emma's future in their hands, waited with the barely concealed anticipation of spectators at a gladiator match. Bradley Whitmore sat across from them, his expensive suit and confident smile radiating the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won. "Thank you all for attending this emergency session," said Mrs. Pemberton, the board chairwoman. "Mr. Whitmore has brought some serious concerns to our attention regarding the Sterling family situation." Christopher's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Before we begin, I'd like to know exactly what concerns we're addressing." Bradley leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Grace with predatory focus. "Concerns about the authenticity of your marriage, Mr. Sterling. About whether the woman representing herself as your wife at school functions has the moral character we expect from Westfield families." Grace felt every eye in the room turn to her. These people, with their designer clothes and inherited wealth, were judging her worthiness to exist in their world, just like her mother had been judged, just like she'd always feared. "I have documentation," Bradley continued, sliding a manila folder across the table, "proving that Mrs. Sterling was employed as your housekeeper until recently, that your so-called marriage appears to be nothing more than a convenient arrangement to present a stable family image to this institution." Mrs. Pemberton opened the folder, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "These are quite serious allegations, Mr. Whitmore." "Allegations?" Christopher's voice cut through the room like ice. "Or a vindictive attack from a man whose advances my wife rejected?" A murmur rippled through the board members. Bradley's confident mask slipped slightly. "This isn't about personal feelings," Bradley said quickly. "This is about protecting our children from exposure to questionable family situations." "Questionable?" Grace spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "What exactly makes our family questionable, Mr. Whitmore?" "Well, Bradley fumbled for words. "The circumstances of your employment, the speed of your marriage, the obvious financial disparity." "You mean the fact that I worked for a living?" Grace stood slowly, feeling something powerful unfurling in her chest. "The fact that I earned my place in Emma's life by loving her unconditionally for 2 years? The fact that I didn't inherit my worth from a trust fund?" The room fell silent. Christopher watched in amazement as the woman he loved transformed before his eyes, not into someone else, but into the fullest version of herself. "You want to know the truth about my marriage?" Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "Fine. Here's your truth." She turned to address the entire room, no longer hiding behind careful politeness. "Yes, I was Christopher's employee. Yes, I cleaned his house and raised his daughter while he hid behind work, because he was too afraid to face his grief. Yes, we fell in love in the most unconventional way possible, through bedtime stories and scraped knees and midnight tears." Grace's eyes found Christopher's, drawing strength from the love she saw there. "I didn't seduce a billionaire for his money. I earned his respect by giving his daughter what she desperately needed, a mother's love. I earned his trust by seeing past his wealth to the broken man underneath. And I earned his heart by being brave enough to risk my own." She turned back to Bradley, her voice deadly calm. "You want to paint me as a gold digger? Go ahead. But you'll have to explain how a gold digger turns down marriage proposals for months, how she tries to run away when things get serious, how she loves a child with no legal claim to her." The board members were listening intently now, leaning forward with genuine interest rather than judgment. "And you'll have to explain," Grace continued, "why your definition of an appropriate Westfield mother excludes someone who speaks 3 languages, holds 2 degrees, volunteers at the Children's Hospital, and has turned a traumatized little girl into a confident, happy child." Mrs. Pemberton looked up from the documentation. "You have 2 degrees, Mrs. Sterling?" "Education and child psychology," Grace replied. "I was working toward my master's in family therapy when my father became ill, and I had to take care of my family instead." Christopher felt his heart swell with pride. These were details Grace had never shared with him, dreams she'd sacrificed for others, achievements she'd never thought to mention. "The real question," Grace said, her voice ringing with conviction, "isn't whether I'm worthy of this school. It's whether this school is worthy of families who choose love over convention, courage over conformity, and authenticity over artificial perfection. She sat down, her hands no longer trembling. Around the table, board members exchanged meaningful glances. Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing? Any proof that the Sterling family situation has negatively impacted their child or our school community?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, not specifically, but because I have evidence to the contrary," interrupted Dr. Patterson, Emma's teacher, who had been quietly observing. "Emma Sterling has shown remarkable improvement this year. Her grades are excellent, her social interactions have improved dramatically, and she consistently speaks about her mother with genuine love and pride." "Her mother?" Bradley's voice was sharp. "This woman isn't her mother, isn't she?" Dr. Patterson's voice was gentle but firm. "She attends every school event, knows every detail of Emma's academic and social life, and provides the emotional support that has helped a grieving child flourish. If that's not motherhood, I don't know what is." Christopher stood, placing his hand on Grace's shoulder. "My first wife died 3 years ago, leaving Emma and me shattered. Grace didn't just put our pieces back together. She helped us become a stronger family than we'd ever been before. She chose us, flaws and all. And we chose her." His voice grew stronger with each word. "If this institution can't see the value in a woman who turns houses into homes, employees into family, and broken hearts into whole ones, then perhaps we're the ones who don't belong here." The room fell silent as board members considered his words. Finally, Mrs. Pemberton spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, would you mind stepping outside while we deliberate?" Christopher and Grace walked into the hallway where Emma sat with Christopher's assistant working on homework. The moment she saw them, she ran into their arms. "How did it go?" Emma asked, looking between their faces anxiously. "We told them the truth," Grace said, holding her close. "We told them we're a family. And if they don't like our kind of family?" Emma's voice was small. Christopher knelt down to meet her eyes. "Then we'll find a school that does. Because, Emma, there are more important things than institutions and reputations. There are people who love you exactly as you are." 20 minutes later, they were called back into the boardroom. Mrs. Pemberton stood, her expression unreadable. "After careful consideration, the board has reached a decision. Mr. Whitmore, your concerns have been noted, but found to be without merit. The Sterling family's personal circumstances are their own business, and we see no reason why those circumstances should affect Emma's standing at this institution." Grace felt Christopher's hand squeeze hers. "Furthermore," Mrs. Pemberton continued, "we'd like to formally invite Mrs. Sterling to join our Parent Advisory Committee. We believe her background in education and child psychology would be valuable assets to our community." Bradley's face went white with rage. "This is absurd. You're setting a dangerous precedent." "Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut him off coldly, "I believe this concludes our business. Good evening." As they walked out of the building together, Emma skipping between them, Grace felt something she'd never experienced before: complete and total belonging. "So," Christopher said, pulling both his girls close, "how does it feel to be officially controversial?" Grace laughed, the sound bright and free in the cool evening air. "Like coming home." And for the first time in her life, Grace Thompson Sterling knew exactly where home was. It was wherever love was brave enough to fight for itself. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the Sterling home. But everything was different now. Grace stood at the marble counter, her wedding ring catching the light as she packed lunchboxes, 2 of them now. Emma's decorated with veterinary stickers and filled with homemade cookies, and little William's, though at 18 months, he was still more interested in throwing food than eating it. "Mama, Will's trying to eat his shoe again," Emma called from the breakfast table, her voice carrying the patient exasperation of an experienced big sister. Grace smiled, wiping her hands on her apron, the same one she'd worn as a housekeeper, though now it felt like a badge of honor rather than a uniform. She lifted William from his high chair, his chubby hands immediately reaching for her hair. "Good morning, my little troublemaker," she whispered, kissing his forehead. He had Christopher's steel blue eyes and her stubborn streak, a combination that promised years of adventure ahead. Christopher appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie with one hand while holding a travel mug of coffee in the other. Even after 2 years of marriage, Grace felt her heart skip when he looked at her like that, like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "The car will be here in 10 minutes, he said, crossing to kiss her cheek. "Are you nervous about today?" Grace shifted William to her hip, considering the question. Today was the grand opening of the Thompson Sterling Foundation for Children, the non-profit organization she'd been building for the past year. What had started as Christopher's idea had become her passion project, providing educational support and family counseling for children from struggling backgrounds. "Excited," she said finally. "Terrified, but excited. The best kind of nervous," Emma chimed in, using one of Grace's favorite expressions. Christopher laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair. At 10 years old, Emma had grown into a confident, happy child who collected stray animals and planned to become a veterinarian who specialized in fixing broken hearts. She wore her scars from losing her first mother like badges of courage, and she loved her second mother with the fierce devotion of someone who understood that family was about choice, not just blood. "Daddy, don't forget you promised to pick me up early today," Emma said. "Grace is speaking at my school assembly about following your dreams, and I want to sit in the front row." "Wouldn't miss it," Christopher promised, though I still can't believe they asked the former housekeeper to inspire students about career possibilities. Former housekeeper, current foundation director, and full-time miracle worker, Grace corrected with a grin. "Don't forget my credentials." The easy banter between them spoke of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. They'd faced skeptics and critics, jealous business associates and judgmental society matrons. Grace had endured whispered comments about gold diggers and social climbers until her work with the foundation spoke louder than any gossip ever could. Christopher had learned to see criticism of his wife as irrelevant noise from people whose opinions didn't matter. His business had thrived, his relationship with Emma had deepened, and his marriage had taught him that real strength came from vulnerability, not control. As they prepared to leave for their respective days, Grace caught sight of their reflection in the hallway mirror. Christopher in his perfectly tailored suit, herself in her professional dress, Emma in her school uniform, and William babbling happily in her arms. They looked exactly like what they were, a family that had been built rather than born, chosen rather than inherited, fought for rather than taken for granted. "Grace," Christopher said softly, pausing at the front door, "do you ever miss it? The simplicity of before?" Grace looked around their home, still luxurious, still beautiful, but now filled with the chaos of real life. Emma's art projects covered the refrigerator, William's toys were scattered across the pristine marble floors, and family photos had replaced the cold perfection of interior design. "Never," she said without hesitation. "This is messier, scarier, more complicated than anything I ever imagined. It's also the most beautiful life I could have dreamed of." Christopher pulled her close for a proper kiss, the kind that still made Emma giggle and William clap his hands. "I love you, Mrs. Sterling," he murmured against her lips. "I love you back, Mr. Sterling," she replied, using the response that had become their private tradition. As they walked toward the waiting car, Emma skipping ahead and William reaching for everything in sight, Grace felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. She thought about her mother, Marie, and wished she could have seen that sometimes Cinderella stories were real, not because of glass slippers or fairy godmothers, but because people were brave enough to believe in love that crossed all boundaries. The foundation's opening ceremony was held in downtown Los Angeles, in a building that had once housed a department store, and now buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. Grace stood at the podium looking out at a crowd that included business leaders, educators, families with children, and reporters who had come to cover the housekeeper who became a philanthropist. 2 years ago, Grace began, her voice steady and clear, "I was a woman who cleaned houses and wondered if I was worthy of love. Today I stand before you as someone who learned that worthiness isn't inherited or purchased. It's earned through courage, kindness, and the willingness to fight for what matters." In the audience, Christopher sat with Emma on his lap and William sleeping in his arms, watching his wife inspire a room full of strangers with the same grace that had captured his heart. The Thompson Sterling Foundation exists because we believe every child deserves what I found in this family: unconditional love, unwavering support, and the knowledge that their background doesn't determine their future. Their choices do. The applause was thunderous, but Grace only had eyes for her family. Christopher was beaming with pride, Emma was clapping enthusiastically, and William had woken up to add his own baby babbling to the celebration. As the ceremony concluded and people approached to congratulate her, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Dr. Patterson, Emma's former teacher, smiling warmly. "I wanted you to know," Dr. Patterson said, "that Emma's essay about her family won the district writing contest. She wrote about how love makes people brave, and brave people make families strong. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. What was the title? My Mom Taught Me That Cinderella Was Wrong. You don't need a prince to save you. You just need the courage to save yourself. Later that evening, after the interviews and photographs and congratulations, the Sterling family sat together on their living room floor, eating takeout Chinese food directly from the containers, while William practiced walking between them. So, Christopher said, reaching for Grace's hand, how does it feel to officially be a success story? Grace looked around at her perfectly imperfect life, her husband with soy sauce on his expensive tie, her daughter teaching her baby brother to say mama, the beautiful chaos of a family that had chosen to love each other against all odds. Like coming home, she said, the same answer she'd given him that night outside the school, when their journey had really begun. And as William took his first independent steps from Christopher's arms to hers, Grace Thompson Sterling knew that some stories didn't end with happily ever after. They ended with happily ever choosing, day after day, to build something beautiful together. What would you have done in Grace's position? Would you have been brave enough to fight for love that crossed social boundaries? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.